It's the language that everyone loves to hate. And for good reason, but because, it was kind of, it was developed quickly, and sort of bugs cropped up into it. Like, if it had taken, full development life cycle before they actually released the first version, some of the bugs that we have in the language today wouldn't actually be there. But before we, sort of to make the history lesson of JavaScript more interesting, we're going to do a Jeopardy style, so I have some candy. And if you can answer the question about JavaScript, then you can get some Valentine's Day mystery fun dip. So the first question, Jeopardy style. This person created JavaScript in 10 days in 1995. Anyone know it? Come on, someone's got it. Oh, we got someone. No. Brendan Ike. Or who is Brendan Ike? Jeopardy style. Okay, so no one gets any free candy for that. So yeah, he made it in 10 days. So if you ever wonder like why the language is the way it is and why it does this really buggy thing, you have to remember that the language was implemented for 10 days. So if you were given 10 days to do something like that, could you do a better job? All right, next question. This was the original name of the JavaScript language. So like when it was in development, it was actually called this. Does anyone know? All right. So this is Jeopardy stuff. Oh. So that's a name. You're getting ahead. So it actually was Mocha. That was what its code name was when it was being developed. But then before they actually released the beta or whatever, it was actually called LiveScript as well. But then they relicensed the name because Java was really popular. They thought, okay, we gotta call it something related to Java, so we're gonna call it JavaScript. People are gonna suddenly want to use it now, which sort of happened. Okay, but then you're getting into the next question. So JavaScript was first standardized under this name in 1997. So someone said that actually. Who was that? It was ECMAScript. So after JavaScript was created in 1995 and had been in the browser for, the first browser was introduced, and I think it was the next question, so I don't want to, yeah, well the first browser it was introduced in was Netscape Navigator. And then shortly after that, Microsoft basically cloned it and replicated all of the bugs exactly in their own implementation. And then a couple years after that, it was standardized into ECMAScript. What is the name of the Microsoft JavaScript implementation? Does anyone know that? Jeopardy style trivia questions. It is JScript. So if you ever see something like JScript, that's actually just Microsoft's implementation of JavaScript. And then I sort of said this earlier, so this is the first web browser, the first browser that shipped with JavaScript. Netscape Navigator. So yeah, you're the first one to answer a question. There you go. The last question though. What? Oh yeah, this is actually perfect. But also now Mozilla owns the actual license to the name JavaScript, but everyone uses it to refer to ECMAScript. So yeah, this is a good starting point if you want to grab pizza and drinks and stuff. A lot of these later, but before we can do that, we're going to look at basic syntax of JavaScript and some of the good parts. And actually, I want you to, so you see this URL, if you just go to, I tried uploading it to the G2 Web Dev repo, but I didn't have internet access. So you just go to richardscollin.github.io/mps. You will get these slides, and you can get them. And you will also be able to use embedded JavaScript console. So, variables in JavaScript are declared with the var keyword, and you use var and the token name or whatever name you're using for the variable, and then you can assign to it. So for this example, I'll cut off some of the stuff. We'll just do var a equals hello world and alert a. And if you're following along in the slides, I have it so that if you press F2, it will execute the JavaScript in the thing. So you can see hello world is run when you run hello world, and then or a equals hello world and alert a. So it just prints out hello world. You can also assign numbers to variables in JavaScript just by same syntax. It's not typed like Java, or it is typed, but it's dynamically typed, so you don't declare the types. So you do var b is equal to 1, and actually in JavaScript, all numbers internally are being stored as doubles. So if, for example here, let's cut out this. If we do alert 0.1 plus 0.2, and actually I typed this wrong if you actually look how I did it, but it should be like that, is equal to 0.3. Is that true or false? If we execute this, it's false. Because of IEEE floating point, it can't actually represent those numbers completely. So like internally it's actually 0.20001, and when you add that with 0.1001, then it's a little bit more, it's enough more than 0.3 to actually not be. So when you have weird things like this sort of weird addition in JavaScript, it's actually not JavaScript's fault, it's IEEE 754 double floating point standards fault, but it's in the language. So JavaScript has the following primitives. It has booleans, numbers, strings, and then it also has an undefined primitive and a null, which null is actually like a type object, but it's still, in most contexts, considered a primitive type of its own. And all of these primitives are immutable, so you can't change the value of a string in JavaScript, if you are a string primitive. So if you have like a string like a, or the character a, so if you're used to like C where you can like change the character at a certain index in a string, in JavaScript you can't do that. So you do have wrapper objects around each of those primitives. So for there's Boolean, numbers, string, and strings, and there's wrapper objects for each of those in JavaScript. So you can call methods on a string, and it will implicitly make it to a string object when you call that method. So an example of this is right here. We have like var s is equal to hello world, and then we do s dot to uppercase. There's actually an implicit object creation here to the string wrapper object. So if we run this, and this might not do what you expect depending on what you would expect. If you expected string dot to uppercase, it just returns the uppercase string. It doesn't actually change the value of the primitive s because it is a primitive and you can't change the value of a primitive. So it will print hello world in all caps and then hello world in lowercase. All caps and lowercase. All right. One of the other. So in JavaScript we have this standard function syntax. So function foo param1. So it just sort of looks like this. So this is the function statement, and this is a function expression. And you can see the differences in syntax. So here we actually have, this is called a lambda, where it's a function without a name, and then we're assigning it to a variable. And there's some differences in the semantics for how these work. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this. You can see, okay, first it prints in foo, and then prints in var, right? That's expected. But let's say we can move the invocation of foo before we actually declare it. JavaScript supports that. That's fine. Foo var. But if we try moving var before we declare it, you will notice that it doesn't call it, because at this point when you run this piece of code, bar has not been defined yet because you're actually assigning to the expression here. Any questions? Yeah.
What if you get a compile error or something that tells you it's not?
You mean this red line?
No, I mean, since you're assigning bar after you've actually called it, so isn't that a compile type?
I don't think so. Let's see if the see if it complains if I actually run it here, because it's not showing errors when I run the console. So I don't think it's a compile time error because you can wait for bar specifically.
Yeah, for bar.
Well, in JavaScript you can just call like function. There's no JavaScript is not compiled. It's interpreted. Okay. So when it's reading this, it doesn't know whether or not bar is defined when it tries to run it, and it'll just try and run it. Yeah. One really nice thing about JavaScript that you don't see in other languages is closures. And basically, you can think of this as an implicit parameter. So like here, so let's just start off, I'm going to, so if we wanted to write a function to add 5 to a number, right? We could do function and then do add 5. And then it could take in a parameter, and it could just return param plus 5. And we can call it can't type on other people's computers. So we're gonna add 5 to 3, and I called alert twice. No, guys, you got a PHP memory. And thank you. That's a piece of candy right there. Where's that come from? So, yeah, I don't know. All right. So go ahead and execute that. So you can see, so this is just a method or a function, and we just take some parameter and then increments 5 and then returns it. Let's say we wanted to write a bunch of methods like this, except we didn't want them to add 5. So like we wanted to create methods that could add a different number each time. So we could use a closure for this. So we could write a function that returns a function. And it will close over. So let's say we want to make a function called make adder. I forget what I called it. But basically what it'll do is we'll give it a number, and it will return a new function that adds that number to the parameter that's given to the other function. So if that doesn't make sense, all sense will be made in a minute. So now I'll change this to num, and this make adder we can do bar add 5 is equal to make adder, pass it 5, and then we created a function that will add 5 to a number that we get. You see how I did that? Makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, it's kind of confusing because if you did something like this in C, the compiler would complain at you and yell at you saying that num is not defined at this point in the program. And that's because, well, first off, you can't declare a function inside of another function, so that's kind of a weird thing that you wouldn't be able to do in other programming languages to begin with. But what's actually happening is that variable num is being closed over That's why it's called a closure when you make that function declaration. So let's say if in here I reassign num. So if I do like num is equal to 1, the value the value of num when I define this function is closed over. So the value of num will forever be 5 when I call this function. Even if I redefine it here, it's still going to. What did I just do? Oh, it was just a new tab. Yeah, so the value of 5 will, or the value will still be 5, even if you redefine it later. So I'll re-execute that. You can see it's still 5 even if you reassign num here. So that's closures, and that's one of the really cool things about JavaScript that people like a lot. So then we'll get to the syntax of objects and arrays. This is sort of just basic syntax. You'll notice that arrays in JavaScript are untyped, or they do not require the type for all of them to be for each element to be the same. And that leads to some interesting behavior later on, which we'll look at. Any questions while we're getting this? Yeah.
What would be the advantage of using closures?
So, like what I gave was one example. So you use them a lot when you don't realize it. And you don't actually, for like a language to be complete or whatever, it doesn't need to have a closure. Like you could write, if I wanted to rewrite this without a closure, what I could do is I could make adder. Like you saw me do it without a closure before, but like you would explicitly say the parameters. So like this function that I'm returning would take in num and parameter, right? So you would explicitly say the parameters instead of implicitly saying them. Yeah, but it makes the syntax a little bit nicer because like it's not actually a parameter to that function that you're creating. It's something that's part of the environment when you're actually defining a function. Yeah, so these are some just creating objects in JavaScript. So let's see, what's the next thing? Yeah, so one thing you can do so like let's look at, we have this MISC. So let's start getting into the course of JavaScript because we've sort of only talked about kind of the nice things of it. So like we have this MISC array, and let's just alert, and I might just go to the JavaScript console to make this a little bit easier. So we have some array. Of things of different types, so like the letter or the character for 1, and like 6, and true, and null. So these are all primitives. And if we print out array, you can also, so something you can also do is console.log is if you're like wanting to debug your program, you can do console.log. When you actually write a script, and it will print into this debug menu instead of having to alert every time you want to see what the output is. But by default, when you're in this interpreter, it automatically prints it to the screen. So we have this array, and so like one thing is you might want to sort an array. So like let's have an array of like numbers. So we have like num array. And then it will be the numbers 100, 1,000, and what's that? So we have this array. And let's say we want to sort it. Well, we can do array.sort and sort it. Or can we? So if we sort it, that doesn't look like it's in sorted order. But it is because JavaScript sorted it for us. So good, yeah, we're happy. So what actually happens is because, like I was saying earlier, JavaScript is untyped. It can't know, or at least this is my logic behind it for how they created it. They could have, if they wanted to, implemented it differently, but this is how it was implemented, and then Microsoft also implemented it that way, and then they made it the standard. So they could have said, or how it actually is implemented, the thought process was, okay, this array can hold any sort of objects, or anything. It can also hold objects. And these objects, I don't know if they're going to all be the same type. And I don't know if I can compare them. The only thing I know how to do with objects is turn them into strings. So basically, if you have an array of stuff in JavaScript, it's going to lexicographically sort them. Because it can't know whether or not everything's a number, or at least when it was originally designed, they didn't do that check. So if you want to get around this feature, you can do num.array.sort, and then you can pass it a comparator. So you can pass it a function, and then give it like 2 parameters, and then return. I forget if I want to return like a-b or how I'm supposed to do it, but we'll try that.
Return.
Thank you. You would get another piece of candy. There you go. So that actually sorts it. So that's just like Java, comparator type thing. Just there are a bunch of little things like this in the JavaScript language that get in your way. You just have to know about. Otherwise, you wouldn't expect it. And then when you try and sort something, you're spending 15 minutes trying to figure out why it didn't sort it properly. Prototypal inheritance is something really cool about JavaScript. So those of you who are used to Java know about class type object orientation, where basically you have one class variable in which every single object, every instance object inherits from that. JavaScript uses prototypes, and basically each object can be used to create another object. Yeah?
Can it be the font size, or maybe shrink the font size?
Yeah, I can just do that.
Okay.
Yeah. So what was this? Yeah, so prototypal inheritance. JavaScript is like the one language or mainstream language that has prototypal inheritance, and it's a pretty interesting idea. Basically, you can use any instance of an object to change, you can inherit from any object. So you don't inherit from classes, you inherit directly from objects. And you can do some interesting things with that. And I'm not going to go through this example in detail, but I just stuck it in there because I thought it was a good example. So now, let's get to the best part of JavaScript, the bad parts. So I already started talking about some of the bad things of JavaScript. And you will learn some more about bad parts. Okay. So one of the first bad things of JavaScript is global variables and poising. So this is sort of, I don't know what the thought process was. Okay, there was no thought process when they put this in the language. But basically, JavaScript will let you use a variable before you declare it. So in this function var I equals 10 var I alert I is still only within the scope of this this function. So first off, JavaScript, if you didn't know, has scope function variable scope. So if you declare a variable within a function, that's for a scope. It's just similar to Python, and different from Java and C, which have a block scope. So I'll just go ahead and run this, and you'll see that it prints 10 like you might expect if you knew that how it works. And then alert I. So for some reason it's print 7 because I'm alerting I. So from one of my other things, I basically have this. So I should have double check my other slides. So if you're following along on these slides, the way I made this, and this is really hacky, but I basically grab the contents in here and just stick it in an eval, which we will get to a bit how that works later. And I didn't even like sandbox it or anything, so like you can do some funny things with this. Yeah, so it prints 10 when it's in this function, or yeah, this function, and then when it gets out and it calls this alert in 7 because I is 7 here. They're defined in the global scope. But if we remove this line and we run this again, what will happen is, okay, we're assigning I to 10, alerting I, and then by default, if you don't declare the keyword bar in the function scope, it's going to override the global I by default. It doesn't give you a warning or anything like that. It assumes you mean global. So it's very easy to forget bar in one of your keyword, or like before one of your variable declarations, and end up with variables that are now in the global scope, which you didn't want to be in the global scope. And that ends up having JavaScript have a lot of like, memory issues when you use it in like larger applications where, now it's in the global scope and theoretically anything should be able to access this, but kind of not. Yeah, you got a question.
If you just declare I and you don't
Declare it up here.
Yeah, if you just declare I, will it assume I is 0 or like because?
So if you don't use a variable, so if we just do something like this,
yeah.
Then I is undefined, right? Is it null?
It's undefined.
It's undefined, yeah. So if you don't use it, it's undefined. So that means if we like did this, so I'm willing to bet that if I run this, it's just going to do the same thing because it's going to keep that. Yeah. But if I do something like
Okay.
and now get rid of that. That still won't give you an error, like you would hope it would.
Hey, Collin.
Yeah.
Show it with var inside, and then just declare it outside.
Like, oh, the right way. Yeah, I should show it the right way. So, like, let's say you're using it out here for.
Right, but like just like have it undefined.
Oh, okay.
Or sorry, I think it's defined in another slide. So just like redeclare it, but don't spell it.
Yeah. So 10, and then we alert, and shouldn't do that. But what if we do a different kind of variable, like or like let's do it here, and let's see if A is defined good. So if we do like, so we just do function. What? Well, let me define it.
You have to one line it.
Shift and tab.
Yeah.
Shift, yeah.
Oh, shift.
Shift enter. So if I do var, let's do A now. So var A is equal to 10. Enter. And then I do like, let's just return. Out here, you'll see that it's not in this global scope. But if we call blah, that 10 is, or A is clearly 10. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So that's one of the first hiccups of JavaScript. So variables or the variable declarations are hoisted to the beginning of the function scope. By default, if you don't give it a variable declaration, it's actually hoisted beyond the function scope into the global scope. The next kind of odd thing about JavaScript is automatic semicolons. So semicolons in JavaScript are optional, in air quotes. And that's because if you have something like this, its behavior is actually going to do this. And you might not expect it to remove that line feed and then make it a function call when you actually want to, call a method on an object that you have. And there's some other, so let's see, the next slide. Yeah, so we could go into the specifics of the rule. But if you know the rules, you can never actually have to put a semicolon at the end of the line. Instead, what you'll do is you'll put semicolons at the beginning of the line. So the NPM is one project that actually follows this guideline where they say, okay, no semicolons at the end of the line. And their JavaScript looks kind of weird. But you see, like, there are cases, like when you write a line of code like this that begins with a character that is considered a special character, so like pluses, parentheses, minuses, anything like that, you put what is called a guarding semicolon before the statement. And that prevents if the developer who codes after you puts a statement above your line of code that doesn't have an ending semicolon when it's needed, it will terminate it with this semicolon right here. So that's kind of interesting. That's one notable project that actually enforces, using no semicolons except when they're required. Another case for why not to use no semicolons is because the ASI algorithm for how it actually does it. So I have the spec here, which is I didn't actually want to print it. So let's go to ASI. Yeah, so you can read the rules, and basically, let's see, here's some examples of what they actually turn into. So like if we have this line, ASI will actually insert semicolons into it to actually make it look like this. It won't ever insert a semicolon for like for loops and anything like that. But if you ever have like a bare return statement, it will always insert a semicolon there, which is a source of a lot of bugs when you're just starting. And also, it will insert semicolons here. If you ever have something like this, this is what its behavior is. Probably the one that's I don't know. There's a good case for just not learning the rule. Just always put a semicolon at the end of your lines. But if you want to make other developers' lives difficult and make them have to read the rules every single time they contribute, if you know the rules, then you can use them. But it's sometimes difficult to do that. So if we actually run this, what it's going to return is undefined. And I don't mean like it's undefined. I mean like it's actually going to return the value undefined. Because what happens is it inserts a semicolon here. I forget if it inserts one here or not, but it basically treats these as labels, these A and B as labels, because you can have like labeled statements in JavaScript, like C, and then adds a semicolon there as well. So it actually won't show us. Yeah, so it doesn't actually print anything. But yeah, so if you're interested, I would recommend reading it. But basically, yeah.
I'm sorry. Regarding the semicolon you were talking about, so that's only if for like developers who are also working on the project with the guarding semicolon, or else you would just put out the end all the time, or is it good to have the end?
So it really depends on your style guideline. So most JavaScript, the way in general you should write JavaScript, unless you feel extremely strongly the opposite way, is basically use semicolons at the end of statements.
Okay.
But if you really hate semicolons for some reason, then what you will do, just like in the NPM project, is you will put semicolons only when they're required to guard your statements. So just certain statements, basically the general rule of thumb is if you have a statement that begins with a special character, like a parenthesis, a brace, plus plus, a minus minus, anything like that, you want to guard that statement with a semicolon. And if you do that, you will be safe. But you also want to make sure you don't make that same mistake where, you know, that's, let me go back. So this trailing, if you think this is going to work, this isn't, because the trailing semicolon is inserted here, and it just returns undefined, and this stuff is just ignored. So you really want to, like, if you're not using semicolons, you need to know what you're doing.
I think if you brought that, if you brought that bracket up.
What?
Yeah, I think if
you
you
move this bracket up, that's going to get around this problem. So so the way doing bracket styling, it is good style. Like, there's no argument about this. Like, you want to do it. Always have some. If you're doing switching lines, you always want to have some sort of trailing character that lets JavaScript know that it's going to continue. So, like, if you have a comma or if you have a plus at the end or something like that, we'll let the JavaScript interpreter know that I don't want you to insert a semicolon here. I want you to continue reading the next line. Okay, so the next thing that's confusing that people don't use in JavaScript a lot, which is the with statement. And Python actually has a with statement, which works decently well. But JavaScript's with statement is not very good because of this reason. So, like, this is an example of, like, or good use of the with statement. So, like, let's say you're going to be using a lot of things in the math standard library a lot, or like the math object. You would say with math, and then you don't have to type math.pi a bunch, or math.cosine, math.sine. But the issues come along where, let's say we have something like this. So we have with O and then alert X. So I'll call this one. This works. Yeah. So 1, right? So X has 1 on it, so it's alerting based off the value there. But if we just change this to Y, like something, it's now going to alert using this parameter instead of this. So the variable it's deciding to use depends on what keys are in this object, which you don't want. And as a developer, it's difficult to look at code like this and see what X is actually corresponding to. If it's corresponding to O or corresponding with this X. And it corresponds with this O. Yeah. All right, so that's one of the other main things. So finally, we have this JS what, and we were trying to get the video working earlier, but we couldn't. So I'll basically do my best presenting whatever. I'll do my best, mimic the pen. So let's talk about JavaScript. So in JavaScript, and actually I'm not going to try and mimic him, but I've seen that video several times, so I just like how he does that. It's like, let's talk about Ruby. Okay, so we're going to, so I wonder how, okay. Yeah, so in JavaScript, so like in Python, you would expect, okay, adding an empty array with an empty array, what should that do? So like, I would say there's 2 valid answers. There's, okay, it returns a new empty array, because you could say it's concatenating them, or it returns like a type error. You can't add two lists. Well, that's not the case in JavaScript. JavaScript returns empty string, because an array plus an array is an empty string. Then the next thing that I'm going to show is, so when you add an array with an object, what do you get? And of course, you get a string containing the word object, because that makes sense. So now let's add an object with an array. What do you get here? Yeah. So I believe you get. Any guesses? Any guesses? Any guesses? Someone want to guess? Oh, come on.
Error.
Okay. Error? That's a good guess. It's candy. You get 0. That makes sense. Okay, and then the last one is an object plus an object. You get not a number, which is probably the only one that makes sense. Oh yeah.
Why is bracket represent? Why do you say that means an object?
An object, so like an object literal in JavaScript, and I showed that briefly earlier, but an object literal is defined like that. But actually, that's a good question because, as I will point out when I'm explaining why this actually happens, the actual presenter of that video failed to realize something important about JavaScript. So before we get into understanding how, or what's actually going on there, we're going to talk about two important methods in JavaScript. And all objects except for null have these two methods. And it's toString and value. And you use them, basically the JavaScript type system makes excessive use of these methods to determine how to coerce the values. So toString is always going to return a string, or should always return a string. And value of, for most objects, the goal of the value of is to actually return a primitive, but most objects cannot be represented as a primitive. So it just returns the object itself and doesn't actually do anything. So JavaScript will just use that and basically is able to tell if the object is a wrapper of a primitive type using that value of. So in addition, or in the addition operator, basically this is the method that JavaScript uses to add two numbers. So when you add like A and B, what it first does is says, okay, I'm going to look at both operands, and if either one is an object, I'm going to convert them to primitives. So we'll say, okay, we'll convert, we'll say we're adding an object on the left and an object on the right. So we do the value of on the object on the left, and to try and get a primitive. Most objects don't return a primitive, but if it does, then we get some primitive value and we continue. If it doesn't, then we would call toString on it, and we would get a string, which is a primitive, and then we can continue working. So then we do the same thing to the other operand. If you call it and one operand is a string, you just automatically convert the other one to a string. And then when you actually add the two, if both are strings, then it's just string concatenation. And then if it's not, at this point we're guaranteed it's a primitive, and there's well-defined operations for getting from any JavaScript primitive to a number, and you would just add it as if they were numbers. So let's get to this first example. So we're adding an array with an array, right? So the array, so if we look, if we try and figure out what the arrays dot, so we call its value of, it is an array, so that's useless. So its value of is just going to return an empty array, and we can't do anything with that. So that means we're going to go to the toString method. We're going to call this toString. So this toString of it is an empty string. Okay, so that means that when we got an empty string, we were actually getting the result of empty array.toString plus empty array.toString, which is just an empty string. So that actually makes the example make some sense, yeah?
What happens if you add a primitive to that?
Like on the outside?
So plus A on the first line.
Oh, okay, so actually,
brackets plus A.
well, so what's A? Oh, like the character A?
Yeah.
So what happens here is, okay, so because A, and actually we can do something really cool. So let's do this. We're going to override, we're going to make an object, and we're going to define its what method? Its value of method, or override its value of. So we're going to do value of and then we're going to do function, and as value of, we're going to alert value of, and we're going to just return, let's see, so this is an object for value of, we just want to return something that, we want this value of to still fail. So we're just going to return a blank object like that. Right. So let me make sure I get these braces right. So that's for the function, and that's for the that. Okay, so now if I just do a, it has this function a.value of, and if I call a.value of, it does that. So if we do, so in this example, if we do a plus, so if we do a plus a number, it's going to call that value of for a. Then it's going to see, okay, so this thing is still not returning a primitive, so now I'm going to call this toString. toString, since I didn't define it, it's probably going to return an empty string. I'm not quite sure. And then it's just going to concatenate empty string with 0, so it should return like string 0 maybe. Which, oh, well, close enough. toString of the object was just object, so yeah. But if we do the same thing but with a character, because of the rules, it doesn't call the what is it? The value of first. It just goes straight to calling the toString. Oh, I'm wrong. But either way, it still prints out the. It still does the toString. But you can actually see how it's calling and the toString when you do operators like this. And there's an interesting blog post where someone overrides the value of and the toString return values to like do operator overloading in JavaScript. So the second example, so the second example is we're adding a array with an object. So we're adding an array with an object using the same logic. We are going to end up with, so I don't want to give you the answer before we're going to end up with doing something like this. Because both calling the value of on an array and an object is just going to return itself, we end up calling the toString in both of them and just string concatenating them together. So, oh man. Okay. So it's just concatenating, so like the toString of this was empty string, and the toString of an object is that object. So let's go to the next one. So this is what you mentioned. So the object literal, so in the other instances, these curly braces were an object literal. But here, because of the way the syntax of JavaScript actually works, in this context, this is not an object literal. It's actually a block. So I can see you can define an empty block of text or of code, and we could have some like code in it that's run. It doesn't make a lot of sense in JavaScript because it doesn't have block scope. But so this is just a bare block, so we can just ignore it. And then we just have, oh man, I can do that. So then we just have this this array and the unary plus operator. So the unary plus operator in JavaScript converts whatever you give it to, or whatever's on the right side of it, to a number. So it's basically doing this. So that's why in that example, if we do this or that, it's actually the same thing as number that, because the number representation of an empty array is 0 for some reason. But that's well defined in the JavaScript standard. Yeah. All right. So the final example. So it uses the same idea. This first thing is, in this context, is just another block variable scope, whatever, so that isn't affected at all. And we're still using the unary plus operator on this object, so we're converting an object to a number, and converting an object to a number is not a number. So yeah, that's how that works. Any questions of how these methods are? So if you saw, like, I like where I overrode that value of. So if I have a, and then let's see, so we're up here. If I do toString, I'm curious what JavaScript will do if so JavaScript assumes that toString is going to return a string in almost all of this type coercion stuff. Because if it doesn't, then it can't really convert it to a primitive. So I'm curious what happens if I actually return something that's not a string and it's toString, how it will actually behave. But I'm just going to alert. And pardon my terrible typing. But we'll say that for in a minute. So first we'll just return. So in the toString we'll just return empty string for no for a. Right. So if I try adding a with anything, so like here, it's always going to do string concatenation for whatever I add. So value of. So if I add a with, it's essentially like doing empty string plus something. But it actually has these side effects. So it's interesting. I think that's the main. Oh, so yeah. So those are like the weird parts of JavaScript, or like the weird type coercion stuff. So now I'm actually going to get into some of using JavaScript for real purposes. So like in the DOM. So for who knows what the DOM is? So someone answer a question or something. What's the DOM? It's on the board. I always love those questions where professors literally ask what something is, and it's exactly what's on the screen, and you just say it, and there's like, congratulations, you know how to read the board. Yeah, so the DOM is the document object model, and it's basically the API for interacting with web pages in your browser. So whenever you want to, if you're in your JavaScript console, and which if you, in Chrome it's Control-Shift-I to open up this console. You can run any of the other sort of code I was showing you before, but you can also access how the actual browser is working by using the document object. So you can access methods do stuff by calling methods on this document. So I can do. Actually, I'm going to go to the next slide. I think I have better examples there. Yeah. So if I wanted to, so we're back to this embedded browser or embedded JavaScript thing. If I want to run this, what this is doing is getting an element by its ID. So if we actually inspect this DOM basics ID, what we can do is inspect element. I gave it I was zoomed in too much, I think the issue. Oh, I see.
Press the thing at the very top. You can hide the console. Press the thing next to the gear at the top.
Oh, I don't want to
No. The one to the left of it. Like you can toggle
okay.
between.
Yeah. So if we inspect this right here, you'll see I gave it that header element or that h2 element an ID of example. So that means I can reference it from my code by accessing it through that. So I can do document.getElement by ID, and then pass it the string example, which was the ID I gave this element. And then I can change the text content of that. So I'll go ahead and run this, and you'll see that my JavaScript thing somehow broke. So I'm going to refresh the page. Oh man. Okay, so let's see. Let me do something real quick. So we're gonna fix this. This is well, either way, we'll just do it like this instead of my cool embedded JavaScript. So we can change the text content by running that. That's the ID for text. Oh, this might be an old version of this, actually. Let's see. So I need to, I believe there's two things that have an ID of example. So I'm just going to change this to example 2.
I can see 2200.
That's a bad example. But there we go. So you can change the text contents of different DOM elements using this DOM API, the document get element by ID, and then you can actually access it. Yeah.
Why can't you change two things at once?
Well, so you can do that with classes, but I actually made the mistake earlier of, I believe up here in a different section, I have another header or an H2 tag that has the same ID. And when the way it works is, so the browser assumes you only have one tag with a given ID at one time. And because of that assumption, if you're searching through your page looking for that ID and you find it, the first one you find is going to be the one you return. So it's actually changing the title for a different slide page I had a couple slides back. So if I just change this to example 2, but no, this is, so let's see if this works now or if I still have other issues. Yeah. Okay, so this is one way to do that. You can also, if you wanted to, use the inner HTML attribute instead of text content. But you need to be aware of what the differences of this are. So if you just want to change the text of something, you should use text content. But if you want to change the actual, let's say you actually want to add, let's say if you actually want to add some HTML into this. So I wanted to insert HTML into this tag, like a link or something like that, you would use inner or .inner HTML. You have to be careful when you do that because it's vulnerable to what are called cross-site scripting attacks. It's basically, one example of that is, let's say you have a web page where you have this .inner HTML somewhere, and actually probably because I'm using eval for this whole JavaScript interpreter thing, it's extremely vulnerable to this. But I don't think there's anything that I really care about on this. I mean, it's being hosted by GitHub on their GitHub Pages thing, so it doesn't affect me, but my users, whatever. So basically, like, let's say your friend, so I make this website, and then I use this somewhere, but I don't check what input I'm actually assigning it from. So let's say the user can actually somehow, let's say within the link, he can insert some values that changes what's in that location right there. So let's say if he changes like some parameter in the link, then whatever's here, he can execute arbitrary JavaScript. All he has to do is make a web link that he emails in spam, and then someone clicks on it. They click on it, the browser automatically opens that page and executes that JavaScript that they wrote and embedded into the URL. So let's say an example of this is, let's say I know Facebook's like API for adding, or one real world example of this is a person was able to find a cross-site scripting vulnerability in MySpace. And the person was able to set it up so that if you clicked on his page, or if you viewed his page, you would execute his JavaScript that would add you as his friend, and then add all of your friends as his friend, and continuing the cycle. So he had like I forget who it was and how many like friends he got, but he had the most friends in like MySpace history just because of this like cross-site scripting browser attack on people. It's kind of funny. So you can actually do real damage with this. You can, once you are able to execute arbitrary JavaScript on someone's page, that entire thing is vulnerable. But let's just continue to other DOM API things. So these are DOM selectors, or element selectors. So different ways we can select elements in the DOM. So let's go back here. And how much time do I have? I don't know if I already finished that. So I know in this web page that I have a lot of elements that are all section tags. So I can do document.getElement by ID or getElement by tag name, and I can pass it. The tag name that I want to select. So I can do section, and this will return a list. Oh, that's cool. How about that? How do I make this? I don't care what this.
Go to the arrow next to timeline.
Yeah.
Okay, click on that and go to console.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then press on the thing next to the gear again to get rid of the extraneous console you have on the bottom. So the green or the blue arrow with the green stripes, if you click on that and get rid of the
Well, I want the console. But is that, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it actually, if you see, it printed out all of these section tags that I have, and there's a lot, because each basically, I have one section tag for each slide in this presentation. And we get a list of that. So we can actually assign that to a variable. And so now we have this list of all these sections that we can access with B. And let's say we wanted to delete them. So I'm curious. So let's say goodbye to the slides, guys. Oh, that didn't work. So what I really should do, because that's a JavaScript keyword. So what I could do is set the display to false. So I could do. Oh, you know why that did that? Because it deleted the list B. Oh, well, let's say. So let's just select like this one. Here, this one example, because I know its ID is example 2, right? So I wanted to delete it. You use. So I first did it with document. Get element by ID. I'm going to use excessive tab. And then I call it example 2. So it stores. Yeah. Then what I can do is I can do get parent. No.
Hey, Colin.
Yeah.
Pull it up to the center.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. That's worse.
Hit the.
Click on the arrow, click the arrow.
Which area?
No.
Yeah, hit
This?
this one.
Nice. Thank you.
Does not get parents. Yeah, so you can query all these selectors using the DOM API, and actually, so people will rely a lot on jQuery to do a lot of this work for you, but most browsers nowadays have a method called document.querySelector, and you can pass it basically a CSS string and do the same thing that the $sign operator will do in jQuery.
Is there performance benefit, or is it just size? Like, you
To
don't have
performance versus what? Versus using like get element by ID, or versus using jQuery?
using jQuery, just for like grid
I don't know about us. I mean, I would think there might be some speed performance benefits because it's actually being implemented in the browser and not in an external library. But I think actually jQuery knows which browsers support that. So if a browser supports that, it will call that. Yeah. So let's do some. So I don't actually let's see. I started working on some other hacky things, integrating it with the current project that we've been working on, but I wasn't able to finish that. And it's on my laptop, not this desktop, and I don't have HDMI. But we could. Oh, so one interesting thing I'll flip to. So, the best references that I've come across for learning JavaScript, this book, JavaScript, the Definitive Guide, is a great book. I have it in my backpack, actually, if you want to look at it. It's like the big, fat JavaScript book that like details every single little feature in it. A shorter book is Douglas Crawford's JavaScript, or not the better parts, that was a reference. He has a book called JavaScript, the good parts, so I should put that in here. And I think it's on GT Web Dev's like resources page. But it's basically, this presentation was called JavaScript, the bad parts, because I was sort of going into details about the weird parts of JavaScript. And Douglas Crawford basically has an opinion that all of those parts of JavaScript are kind of weird, and you spend more time worrying about them than you actually do, making code that works right and properly. So if you just restrict yourself from writing those weird parts of JavaScript and only writing JavaScript code that doesn't have that weird parts, then you will be writing the good parts of JavaScript, and your code quality will increase a lot, and you will write less bugs. So that's at least the basic idea of that theory. One thing that I stuck in here, so I talked briefly about like JavaScript history, and so I'll talk briefly about like browser history as well. So the first web browser used before Netscape Navigator was actually called Mosaic, and it was made basically by a bunch of kids in college, and it was no JavaScript, no anything, just ways of viewing HTML, very basic HTML, not this kind of HTML we have today, but paragraphs, header, or H tags, stuff like that. Maybe images, if you're lucky. But so they developed this browser called Mosaic, and one guy was like, okay, this thing's getting huge. I'm gonna talk to people who are making Mosaic, and we're gonna start a company, and we're gonna make tons of money. So they basically, the people who were behind Mosaic quit that browser and started working at Netscape for their browser, Netscape Navigator. And Navigator browser was actually given the code name Mozilla, which stood for Mosaic Killer, because it was supposed to kill the Mosaic browser and be the new browser. And there's actually an image, so if we go to, we're going to look up Netscape. I wish I was but there's a cool image. This dinosaur, that's the Mozilla Mosaic Killer boxing champion or whatever. Yeah. So after Netscape created their browser, and then in their browser they added JavaScript and a bunch of other cool things, and then Microsoft decided that they needed to create a browser to compete with Netscape, and they created Internet Explorer and JavaScript and all that stuff. And then eventually, because of a bunch of different reasons, Netscape started losing a lot of money, and it was mainly because of Microsoft shipping Internet Explorer with Windows. So by default, people would already have Internet Explorer installed, and they wouldn't even wouldn't even install Netscape anymore. So as Netscape was going bankrupt, what they did was they released the source code for their browser. And out of that, we actually have Firefox and Mozilla, but which actually at this point no longer contains any of the original. There's like a whole rewrite. But when that was released, it was released, and Mozilla was the foundation for creating, supporting that browser. But before they released the source code, they had to remove all of the expletives from the source of the browser. So this is probably someone just ran grep on a huge directory with searching for curse words. Some of these are, and this is kind of weird. But so I started looking at the person who posted this, their personal page. So their personal webpage is kind of cool. But if we even go, it was about maybe, no, that's not it. Tech. I forget where it was, but he has. Here we go. Yeah, if you don't know, this is actually, let's see how he's implementing this. That's not what I want. I just want to see the files.
Sources.
Sources, then.
Yeah, click on indents.
Oh, so is it just all of them?
Yeah.
Oh man, he's coding like a true straight up JavaScript. Is that really all it takes? I'm gonna have to look at that a little bit later. That's kind of impressive. No, but like I said, it was in his hacks right here. So yeah, he has some interesting things. And the one thing I saw, which I thought was interesting, he wrote these are a bunch of little scripts he wrote, but I noticed this one at the bottom. It's if you hate your job, apparently he really hated his job working in Netscape, but the thing keeping him working there was he was making an extremely absurd amount of money. So he wrote a script telling him how much money he was making and how much money he would have lost if he left at that current moment. I'm curious if it would still work. I'm pretty sure it's in Perl or something. Yeah, sorry. So I didn't end up getting to adding anything to our current project on GitHub. And we can work through something if you guys want to do that, if that sounds. I'm just going to search. Because I started doing something, that's not. What is this? Titus?
No.
This is my blog. Okay, I'm apologize. Was this the resume thing that they
Yeah,
made?
this is the resume.
Okay. Is that anyone's in here?
No.
I'm curious that one came up before. Maybe it was my spacing.
Our visibility is pretty bad.
Yeah.
You gotta boost it. Let's see,
First one? The first one is top. First one?
so yeah, we can implement something real quick if you want to. We can go through the website. That's not. Where's it being hosted? Oh, is it being hosted on GitHub pages or no?
You have to,
Well, does it doesn't have the GitHub pages branch though.
Oh, it's in the go back in the main.
Either way, I think. Would you guys like me to like add something to that? I started working on something, but I didn't actually finish it. So I can work on that. We could just if you would prefer. But which it was here? You
Yeah,
said?
it's that one. Thank you. So if you go to that,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Is it just the direct? Okay. This is still an older version though. Yeah. But try hacking something together. CSS3. Is that CSS3 or is that just
That's just by default.
yeah, default wrapping?
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Hey, Collin, if you want, Firefox has a sandbox. You can just type in JavaScript and things like see it returns and everything, and press run instead of like doing weird constants.
Well, actually, I think I'll end it because I don't actually have the thing prepared, and I don't want to fumble along or too long and have you guys just being bored watching me. So I think that'll be it. We'll hang around and I can answer questions and whatever.